says on your party's website that all of T.O.P's policies are evidence-based and pass through your expert policy committee. They're based on what works, including what's the best of what you see overseas, not what sounds catchy or polls well. Just how evidence-based are we talking?
The policy committee is very separate, and so that's run by a group of researchers and anyone else who really wants to get involved in policy design, policy writing. And they go through their research processes, and then we get our work peer reviewed. And it will change depending on what the policy is that we're talking about in terms of all of the input that goes into any one policy. So with our urban planning, for example, the main writers of that one got in touch with the likes of Infrastructure New Zealand and a number of social housing providers to get that really community and industry-led advice in there as well as part of the drafting process. I think the best part about it is its distinction from the politics side of things. Because, I mean, look, you're going to get the other parties and their politicians are going to pick and choose the policies because it's going to buy them votes, or it's going to sound good, or it's going to be sellable. But our number one focus is this going to work?
How can you prove to the public that your expert committee or the process you go through is, in fact, impartial?
Well, they don't have, I guess we never give them an agenda. So how we create policy in any given space comes down to who's come forward to create a policy in that space. So a good example is we don't have a big area where we have a gap in our policy. You might have seen we don't have any sort of trade. We don't have any international trade policies. We don't have any foreign affairs policy, anything like that, because we simply didn't have any experts in those areas come forward and work on policy in that space for us. And so while I, for example, am very interested in foreign policy, I'm certainly not an expert in that area, and I'm not going to tell the policy team to say X, Y, Z about foreign policy because it makes me feel good. So we really do just rely on volunteer power in that regard. We don't pay anyone for policy writing. We just don't have that ability. So there's no taint either, I guess, is the silver lining in that. As far as party policy goes, ensuring that everything is independent from agenda, if you want.
That seems to be
a part of our identity.
That seems to be a huge problem in Australia. Is there's lots of vested interests, especially when it comes to mining and to coal and all kinds of different things. How do you guys go about funding?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. For us, it hasn't been an issue because I haven't seen the stats come out of this year yet, but 2019 anyway, our average donation was $20. So it's a lot of people giving a little, effectively. And so that broad base of support means you don't have, a small handful of really influential donors. I mean, you mentioned Australia, it is an issue there, but we still have it here. I mean, last year, ACT received $160,000 from one man alone, who is a very rich property developer. So, and that was more than double, that was double all of T.O.P's earnings for last year, just to put a little context in this.
And you consider your party a progressive party, and you say Labor is quite conservative. I wonder what you'd think of the Liberal Party in Australia, which is actually the Conservative Party.
As so many are around the world, they use that label. It's a hail back to the neolib changes, and they are the parties who hold tight to neoliberalism with all their might. Even though, again, liberalism was never about freedom for everyone.
Yeah, I always thought that was strange because neoliberalism's like, oh, you're all born equal, but it doesn't take into account people who are born into poverty. Or my background, I've worked in disability for over 13 years now, and if you're born with a disability, you are born into disadvantage often because you were instantly discriminated against. So I feel like neoliberalism doesn't take that into account.
It doesn't live in reality, and we are still fighting against that mindset now. There are still people of this whole entire campaign for me personally, what I found the most challenging by far was the amount of people that would say to me things like, poor people deserve to be poor. And, nothing of this entire campaign, you can diss T.O.P, you can diss our policies. I don't care, that's fine. You know, everyone's entitled to their views. But when people say things like poor people deserve to be poor, that's just such a deep-rooted mindset that is very difficult to challenge. And it comes from this, they live in sort of this myth of what our country is, which is kind of what you were saying, everybody's created equal, and so everyone has the same starting point, so just work hard and you're going to be fine. Now, it's a complete myth, because as you've mentioned, people are born into poverty, intergenerational poverty, and it's far more complicated than that, and ignores the fact that we have working poor. We have poor people who work multiple jobs to pay their rent or their mortgage, whatever it be.
One of the policies T.O.P brought to the last election was the universal basic income. This was something that our former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, looked at introducing in the 80s in Australia, but it was too hard to take to election. Or at least, I think they dropped it after the election. And from what I can tell, the countries who have a UBI, a universal basic income, on average have lower unemployment levels. Why do you believe this is a good idea?
So many reasons why I think we need a UBI. In the New Zealand context, at least, because this is what we've been talking about, we have this huge welfare trap in our system, and it disincentivizes work. We have a system where, you're a beneficiary, you're receiving money, but as you start to work and you start to get ahead in life, the government claws back the welfare support that they're giving you, to the point that there's a period of time where you're working for between $2 and $4 an hour. And so unless you get yourself over that trap and over that hump to over 20 hours a week at least, which for many beneficiaries, the only type of work they can get to start with is part-time work. It is really up to that 20-hour-a-week mark. And so for that whole period, it is not worth their while. It makes no financial sense to do so. For some, actually, they're worse off. So with a UBI, it is just gets rid of that welfare trap completely. You get it no matter how many hours of work you do in a week.
What about if you introduced penalty rates? Because I was shocked when I came here, and penalty rates only seem to exist if it's negotiated with the people you work for. They're not legislated, whereas in Australia they are, and penalty rates, they go to the lowest paid workers. So if you work a weekend, you are compensated by getting time and a half, or if it's a public holiday, you get double time. And that's a way of making it more fair. Do you think that's something New Zealand might adopt?
I don't think it's not something I remember being spoken about at all this year. I don't remember a conversation around that. I don't think that's coming out of the major parties from what I've heard. It might have. What we need, what our focus is anyway, is really simplifying the entire system and not kind of adding more complications or more sort of paths to complicate what is already quite a complicated system here.
That's a good point.
We just need a modern, simple system, and that is really what the UBI gives us.
Some people would argue that a UBI would lead to entrenched poverty and an underclass if it's and you're proposing, I think, $250 a week. What would you say to that argument?
It's a baseline, so it's not a ceiling. So, for example, currently, if any beneficiaries are earning, let's say, $350 a week with their benefit, they will still get the current level of whatever it is that they're receiving. It's just that the first $250 are unconditional. So we're not here to say everybody has to be able to live off $250 a week. It's a safety net.
From memory, I think part of Bob Hawke's argument was that it would actually tackle homelessness. How do you sell that policy to the public, though? Because a lot of people will be like, oh, then people are just going to sit on that and, not work ever again and they call it bludging off the dole. I don't know if they use this expression here.
Yeah, we have that in some crowds say that as well.
How do you argue with those people? Not argue, how do you convince them?
Yeah, It depends who you're talking to as to what you think they're going to worry about. But if they think everybody is going to just stop working and just stay on the couch all day, then, the first question is, well, would you do that? And they'd say, no, not me, but everyone else. It's this interesting mindset that we have as people, is that we're not lazy, but everyone else is lazy. But if everybody thinks that they're not lazy, there's a trend there. Well, when we look around at some of the studies that we can draw on, and there have only been really smaller studies. So the one from the 70s in Canada is a great one. The more recent one in Finland is probably more helpful because it is more recent and it is in just the last few years. And their impact on employment was very small, but it was the people receiving the UBI did have an increase in working days. So it was a small increase. It was only 6 days. Increased compared to the control group, but it definitely tells you that it doesn't decrease work. And in the 70s example in Canada, which I think is a helpful example in terms of culture perhaps, they only had a decrease in work for 2 groups. One were parents. They spent more time with their children, and the other group were young males, and they studied longer. It's the 70s. But I think given our huge welfare trap in New Zealand, that is a huge disincentive here, we would see a track upwards of employment increasing. It's not just about the jobs, it's not just about employment, it's about people's well-being. The Finnish example, depression rates dropped by 1/3 in the group receiving the UBI. That is, it is absolutely huge. And there are knock-on effects. So it was only a 2-year study, so it is very confined. What would be, and it's an open question, we don't know, but what would be the impact then on people feeling so much happier? Are they then going to go out into the world? Are they going to be more inclined to go into the workplace? Are they going to have more confidence? Are they going to interact more positively in society when they're feeling better about the world? They're less anxious.
I find a lot of your policies quite agreeable, mostly because they do seem to be based on science and facts. However, your party only received 1.5% of the vote at the election, which I believe is the same percentage that the New Conservatives received. I've recently interviewed them as well. Why do you think the Opportunities Party, T.O.P, performed so poorly at the last election if your policies are based on logic?
It's a very great question. And I think there's a lot of layers to the onion because, we have to think this is in the context of an MMP system where it's meant to mean more parties in government, more representation. But many voters and the media reinforces this idea that your choice is really between 2 parties. So you are already against a system that is stacked against newcomers, really. And the 5% threshold is a huge barrier, and the wasted vote is also a huge barrier.
Do you feel like some of it goes back to funding and finances, though? Because that's when I spoke to former leader Leighton Baker of the New Conservatives, he was saying, these other parties, they got big cash to throw around and we don't. We rely on people power. Is that it?
It has a huge impact. That was something that right at the start of this year, when I realized just how much of an impact it had, it was very difficult to reconcile that with my idea of what New Zealand's democracy was. Absolutely, without a doubt, money has a big impact.
That's a huge concern to me because I don't have big financial backing. I don't want to sell out to anyone. What's the best advice you could give for me as I run up to an election? How do I get my name out there? How do I get people switched on to my message?
Organise. Something the Greens, I would say, possibly are the best at in our country is organising. Grassroots, on the ground, getting out there, door knocking on every single door multiple times in your electorate. That's something that you can only do when you have organised people power. We at T.O.P, we have a lot of people scattered all around the country, but we didn't have the numbers of feet on the ground that the Greens did, and that allows them to door knock everywhere where they need to.
I need an army, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, if you don't have money, you need an army for sure. Okay. Getting connections with local community groups that you align with and just start working with them, and then they will recognize you and know you. And it's just looking for endorsements.
We never had a treaty in Australia. We still don't. Again, Bob Hawke almost brought one in the 80s. Do you think it's too late for Australia?
I don't think it's ever too late to work to repair what has been pretty atrocious behaviour against our Indigenous people. It's yes, the harm that's been caused sadly won't ever be fixed and ameliorated, but you can say, right, here's our line in the sand, and from now here's how we're going to build a relationship together. And I don't think it's ever too late to seek to do that and seek to build a partnership. And keeping in mind, yeah, we've had the treaty in place for 160. Yeah, I don't know.
I recognise that it's highly,
and we haven't complied with it, even though it existed anyway. It's something that we're constantly having to work on, and so we every day have to start again and try and repair the breaches that we've committed.
The difference I see coming here is that having that treaty in place, you had a starting point to work from, and there's been changes that have come from that, even if it wasn't perfect. We never even had the treaty, and for me, it's a really big missed opportunity, and it's quite shameful in a way, because there are First Nations people, and for a long time they're still not properly recognised in our constitution. We've had the Uluru, I think it's the Uluru's Statement from the Heart, which is Indigenous councils coming together to advise the government on what they need to close the gap, and the huge disparity between health outcomes and economic outcomes for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And the government of the day, the Conservative Party, doesn't seem keen to listen or adopt or have that voice. I feel like I'm running as a senator, but there's not going to be a change in Australia unless there's a big change of party.
You're talking about a huge culture shift within the Australian population that need to recognise that their current race relations are terrible and that they need to seek to fix it. And that you really need the push from the public.
The things that come up when I travel around the world, which I've done a bit, and when I've been in New Zealand, is that other countries' perception of Australia is that we're racist and we don't care about climate change, and we treat refugees like crap and we lock them up. Is that something that you're aware of? Is that a perception? I'm not saying it's something that you...
Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely. None of those things surprised me, that those are stereotypes that you hear. Yeah. None of that surprises me. And I mean, whether or not there's any base to it, whether or not it's all unfair, I guess it's in the context of international stories that are bad travel. The opposite is true for us here in New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern is being heralded as this kind of goddess when we have the most unaffordable housing in the world, and our inequality gap is getting worse and worse every single month. So that story is not spreading. So for some reason, we've got the opposite problem, I guess, to you, where this sort of false sense of New Zealand as this beautiful paradise is being sent around the world. And you talk to people who are working multiple jobs to pay their rent, if that feels like a fair analysis.
Well, on behalf of all Australians, I'd like to say that most of us aren't racist. We do campaign for refugees to not be locked up in Nauru, Manus Island, or Christmas Island. And what was the other thing? Oh, climate change. Yeah, we want action on that. We had the strongest action on climate change when we had Julia Gillard in for a while. Our emissions went way down, and then the Conservatives came in, and lo and behold, they've gone way up again. But anyway, that's just me just having a whinge. Okay, Shai Navot, thank you heaps for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope that you remain the leader if you want to be, and I hope to see you again in the future when I'm elected Australia's
good luck.
Senator. Yeah.
Good luck. I'll be following.
Thanks.
It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. And Merry Christmas, hey?